We're back.
Okay, thank you. So I'll try to do a really quick walk through the statute, and so that you can have a general, at least 30,000 foot level understanding of it. So decanting only applies to express irrevocable trusts. So it's express means written, basically. And the trust has to be irrevocable because you don't really need it if it's revocable. You know, the settlor can change the trust, so you don't need it. It will not apply to charitable trusts, particularly where trusts are the sole beneficiary. So if it's a trust for American Red Cross, you can't decant it in that. And the decanting power, it's not a toggle of on and off. It can be moderated and could be limited in some way. Also, like the directed trust, a power of appointment is not considered to be decanting. And that's where the beneficiary is granted the power to say who gets a share of the trust when he dies. In 1404, it basically says just because you have a power to decant doesn't mean you have to exercise it. So, and oftentimes that's the case. So again, as I say, decanting is when we have unforeseen circumstances. In 1405, it's a good idea just to understand the difference between governing law and jurisdiction. So a trust may say that it is governed by the laws of Vermont, but its jurisdiction will be where the place of administration is, because that's what our statute says. So that if the place of administration, let's say, is Massachusetts, then if you want to bring an action or anything, you have to go to Massachusetts. You have to go where the trustee is, sue the trustee in their own jurisdiction. The trustee doesn't have to go out to the multi-jurisdictions of where the beneficiaries are located. And that's a concept that's in the Vermont Trust Code. 1406 is called reasonable reliance, and it means that if there's been a trust, the people have the ability to reasonably rely on the trust decanting. And if they do so, they're not held to be liable if something goes wrong. And that's a concept that carries through a lot of uniformities. 1407 and 1408 are important statutes in that they tell you how to decant. That basically you have to give notice to the settlor, the beneficiaries, any person who has a power of appointment, any person who could remove and replace the trustees, any co-trustees or co-fiduciaries, any trust director. Let's see, if I had said this first and you didn't know what a trust director was, it would have been sort of complicated. And of course, notify the AG if you've got some provision in the trust that it's not solely for charities, but there is a provision in there that might be for the general public. You have to notify the AG if you don't have a named charity. 1408 is just basically our virtual representation statute. Just to remind you, in the Uniform Trust Code, if you're trying to give notice to minors, or in our trust law, we want to give notice to unborn children. There's a virtual representation, so you can bind those people as getting notice by notifying their parent, usually, provided the parent doesn't have a conflict of interest with their child in the trust. And then finally, you can invoke in 1409, you can invoke the courts. And if you need to get some clarification of that, or how large or how small the power is, or you want a special fiduciary to be appointed, so there's this enabling statute to able to us for the trustees to go into court and get some direction from the court. In 1410, labeled formalities, it basically outlines what you have to do formally to decant and keep a record of it so that we know that what's happened. But one thing about, and then 1411 is a super important provision, and that's called decanting power under expanded distributed discretion. And the next one, 1412, under limited discretion. But the important point there is that number one is you cannot be adding beneficiaries that dilute the interest of the other beneficiaries. You cannot make a remainderman who has to wait for someone to die to get their interest. You can't make them a current beneficiary generally. And you cannot reduce or eliminate any vested right. So that's basically, don't be changing the interests of the beneficiaries. That is a somewhat conservative view. New Hampshire basically wrote a very liberal view and said that you could eliminate beneficiaries. And I was probably one of the biggest trust cases in this area was out of New Hampshire, where the trustees decanted and they were basically disinheriting children of the settlor that the settlor had an argument with. And they didn't talk to anybody about it or anything like that. I was an expert witness for the beneficiaries. And basically they said, hey, the courts, this New Hampshire Supreme Court said, you can exercise your decanting power, but you are still subject to those fiduciary duties that are in the Vermont trust or in the trust code. New Hampshire has the uniform trust code. So you were impartial. You were excluding some children, but not others, just because the settlor had some words with some of his kids. You can't do that. So that's the guardrail, that in these trust decantings that you owe a fiduciary duty to the beneficiaries.
Mark,
so yeah.
You stop it when you finish with this section, stop at 1413, and we'll come back to that in the next week.
Okay.
Would that be okay? Because I've got other witnesses on a different bill that I want to take up this morning.
That's fine with me.
So whenever you're finished, are you at 1413 right now?
I'm at 1413.
Okay, so why don't we stop there and we'll come back to this, Eric, and move on to our bill on which we all have heard a lot of comment about and testimony. And so this gives us an opportunity for the administration with their concerns about H645, which is the restorative justice bill. So I think Jay, you may go first, and then we'll hear from Isaac. That's okay with Isaac.
Derek.
Eric, I'm sorry, Derek.
That's okay.
God, why did
You're used to hearing from Isaac a lot, so.
Yeah. Well, it was dark when you came in, and I couldn't really see you clearly. The lights were out. Isaac, thank you for being with us. Jay, thank you for being here. We appreciate it. And we're taking up H645, an act relating to expanding approaches to restorative justice.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Senator Sears and committee. For the record, Jay Pershing-Johnson, Governor's Council. I asked Ben Ben, did you get that? I sent a PDF of an excerpt of a CSG report that was done in 2020 that made some recommendations with respect to our justice reinvestment system. It wasn't the primary purpose of the CSG work, but they took really a very broad look at our justice system. We made a lot of changes at that time, and so this wasn't the primary focus. We didn't make any changes at the time to restorative justice organizations, but they did end up making recommendations in their report. And so that's what I provided to the committee. On page 36 of the PDF, they do a nice little, so my concern basically is based, generally speaking, on the CSG report and their recommendations. Experts who have analyzed the current system recommend consistency in the types and quality of the services offered. This bill does not really address the types and quality of the systems offered. It seems to expand diversion largely through a codified system of pre-charge diversion and adds measures designed to more or less boost pre-charge and pre-trial prosecutor referrals. I think that has been watered down substantially since the House version, which I think was sort of intended more or less to coerce prosecutors to make those referrals, but I think it's been somewhat watered down to reflect, with some respect for prosecutor discretion. But I think that once you have a more consistent delivery in the types of quality of service offered, you are then able to develop, and this is what the CSG observes, you're able to develop relationships of trust, and then for prosecutors to have faith in the system and expand referrals. So I think they've done it a little bit backwards here, trying to bump referrals before actually taking a really hard look at the consistency of the delivery of services across the state in various counties and perhaps regions. So again, referring to the Council of State Governments work, they nicely summarize the off-ramps and the evolution of the off-ramps. I think that if you are listening, or I don't know if you've heard from Ms. Cipriani in Bennington.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've also heard from my state's attorney in Bennington, not in committee, but in an email
Oh, all right.
with tremendous concerns that you're expressing.
Okay.
That she is concerned with this bill and some of the paperwork that's involved with it.
Well, yes, I think a lot of that is on the pre-charge side. So the thing that I liked about Ms. Cipriani's testimony was, at least in the House, and I'm sorry I missed it in the Senate, is she did a really nice walkthrough of the evolution. She has a single restorative justice organization in Bennington County. It has evolved since the beginning, pretty much, with the various services as the state has required sort of this kind of restorative justice approach in various areas, and how she has managed to grow the size and keep her organization in, basically there's one organization that provides all of these services soup to nuts, how she manages it, but at the same time, the burden that's placed on these organizations in managing the administrative paperwork. You've got at least three different sources of funding, with two different kinds of funding coming from the AG's office. And so basically managing the paperwork, managing the grant requirements, I think she said it takes maybe something like a day out of the week just to do the administrative work that's required to keep up with the state's and others' reporting requirements. So anyway, I found her testimony very compelling in terms of a great description of what. And then I think what I really liked about it, to the point of the CSG and relationship of trust, is that the expansion of referrals in Bennington County has been based largely, it seems to me, on that system of trust. And as the state's attorney's office has gotten more and more comfortable with the level of delivery of services and the capacity that's offered from the restorative justice organization, they will refer more cases. They tend to have some flexibility to do so. If they have the oddball case, they can just call up the restorative justice organization and say, hey, do you think you could handle this person? This is something that we don't think should really be in the courts right now. So I think that there is a certain amount of flexibility and relationship that's involved between the state's attorneys and the restorative justice organizations. On page 37 of the CSG report, it also goes into, so basically it says diversion, pretrial, and alternative justice programs often vary in access and quality by county. This is a function, I think, both of what's offered, the funding that's offered, the services that are available, and the referrals that are made by the prosecutors' offices. But they go on to say that the referrals will also lead to variations in who is able to receive or participate in these programs, depending on the level of confidence that state's attorneys, judges, or defense counsel have in the programs available in the county. So again, I think that goes to the issue of quality and consistency of services. They also note data collection and outcome reports are inconsistent, and some programs may be duplicating efforts depending on their structures and target populations. So, I mean, it seems to me that when you look at this, the restorative justice reporting that's done, it's a little bit opaque, and it is definitely inconsistent. And I think that we could be working on what's needed to develop a more uniform reporting kind of structure. So CSG reported or recommended consolidation of the administration of reparative panels, court order diversion, Tamarack, and pretrial services into shared regional locations. Again, this would be to achieve consistency in the types and quality of the services offered. It would facilitate uniformity of policies, programming and staff training, grant funding, administration, and reporting. It would be far easier to hold organization accountable for meeting performance measures based on outcomes. And I think the goal ultimately would be to foster relationships of trust with the prosecutors who are making and expect to expand the referrals for different kinds of crimes and expanded types of crimes. This bill doesn't offer anything in the way of more equitable distribution of restorative justice services across counties and regions. And in fact, it defers planning, just planning, to streamline and deduplicate services in counties with more than one pre-charge and post-charge diversion provider until 2027. And that's in section 7 of the bill. It also ensures that the funding status quo for counties with more than one pre-charge and post-charge diversion provider, and that's in section 8 of the bill. So I think that just addressing the referral side without regard to the types and qualities of services offered and outcomes really misses the boat on maybe where we would like to see change made, more in accordance with what, or more consideration of the kinds of points that the CSG makes. It fails to take into account a uniform system of risks and needs assessments, and it fails to take into account repeat offenders or offenders who are not referred for restorative justice because of pre-existing criminal dockets. I mean, there are reasons sometimes that prosecutors don't refer individuals to restorative justice. There are also some provisions that don't really make sense to me, including the denial of the pre-charge diversion resources to organizations in a county where a prosecutor fails to adopt a pre-charge diversion policy. And that's on page 7, lines 4 through 6. So there's a requirement to adopt a pre-charge policy, but there's a sort of, I guess what you call incentive to do so by penalizing the restorative justice organization. Doesn't make that much sense to me.
What we did with law enforcement who failed to adopt policies regarding racial equity.
Yes, yeah, I think it's, I guess it's the same idea. Right, but it would,
But that's a different
and
subject.
it would penalize, well, but it would penalize the law enforcement agency that's not adopting the policy.
Right.
As opposed to a third party
Right.
providing benefits, theoretically, that this state's attorney would use regardless of whether they have policy.
Right.
Anyway, that just,
Anyway, that I know where
that's sort of what I
came
came
from, but
Okay, I understand. And the system that is created for developing pre-charge criminal records. So essentially, including a finding of probable cause, and then a system for deleting those records, which, but for this bill, wouldn't exist. So I think that there's also a question about whether this kind of regulation of what currently exists in the state as a flexible pre-charge process, whether it will actually reduce the current use of pre-charge referrals if law enforcement is required to do the investigation, make a finding of probable cause. At that point, is the prosecutor more likely to charge or not charge, or divert to pre-charge, or take it into the court adjudication system? I'm not sure. And again, I'm not sure that this would do what it attempts to do. I know what they're trying to do by codifying a pre-charge process. But I think that the way that has been done is not necessarily something that would essentially, it may not be a process. I guess it's just my concern there. I also object to a new system of pre-charge records erasure again, with unintended consequences. That extends to records which are not erased now, which may be useful in repeat offense situations or other situations where in communities, it's just that there's an erasure of records that is a system that doesn't exist now, that I think could have unintended consequences. If the legislature were to go in this direction and require this level of record development and then erasure, I guess I would change the word
What
deletion
did the,
to sealing.
well, one solution is, what does a person who's been through successfully completed a diversion program say when asked if he or she got arrested?
Or if they successfully complete, oh, and you're saying pre-charge?
Yeah.
I think pre-charge. The theory is they're never arrested, right? I mean, they're not in the system.
They haven't been cited or.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm just curious as to, back in the day, I think we said that even though we think of, you know, there was something in there that you just say you've never been arrested. But I don't remember where we did it, but I think we just gave, if you successfully completed the diversion program, could you just say, even if you were arrested, the answer would be no, similar to what happens if we.
I think if it's pre-adjudication and you successfully complete diversion and your record is expunged after 2 years, you can say that, and everybody has to say it. Yeah.
Erica Mathis did say, victims and defendants alike will be heard if we're forced to delete more records. We have a working Bennington County pre-charge program. This bill will present issues with our daily work in diverting young people and adults alike prior to finding probable cause. I'm drowning in work as it is, and I cannot divert more time to administrative work. This would take, I'd rather spend time on the phone talking to Letha, as I've already done this week, problem solving on a person by person, case by case basis.
Yes, right. I mean, I think that's the kind of flexibility.
Backs up what you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think that their pre-charge is it's an interesting issue, right? Because it's pre-charge, technically there is no record. But there are prosecutors and there are police departments that are looking to get individuals in their communities help by diverting them into restorative justice and other resources. And, you know, sometimes it's just a direction, show up there today. I think that maybe where it comes down is reimbursement. And I'm not completely clear on this, but I don't know if they're only paid per referral. And pre-charge referrals wouldn't count because technically they're not referrals. I think it would be interesting, I mean, I would need to know, obviously, more about how the allocation of resources made to restorative justice organizations. And maybe the issue is not so, I mean, if what you're trying to do is bump referrals to bump more resources to more community justice organizations, maybe the funding structure is the problem. Because again, we've got.
That has always bothered me.
Yeah.
The funding structure, having Lisa, and I've chatted with her many times, have to apply to 3 different state agencies for similar grants.
Yeah, right. And then
Rely on those state agencies to continue those grants. Well, including the Attorney General's office.
Yeah, right.
But she has large, she has the Department of Corrections, and then she has to go to the Attorney General's office.
Right. And it's my understanding there's 7 or 8 counties with single restorative justice organizations so basically you have a single provider providing all of those services for the range.
And then she has to, right, she does grants, she does local governments kick in some cases, and I'm not sure how much individual communities provide, but she has local support of the match grants. And so, I mean, it's quite a task to try to and then have 3 separate funding sources.
Right. Yeah, that was really what I got from her testimony. Yeah. So I also think, and I said this in the House Judiciary Committee, and I had this conversation with, Aaron Jacobson in the AG's office, is I feel like there might be a missed opportunity here to understand and more effectively use existing systems, particularly Tamarack and DOC post-adjudication diversion, working in tandem, which I think is maybe a missing piece, with, say, the Department of Health, the Department of Mental Health, or select service providers to more effectively connect justice-involved individuals to drug treatment and mental health services. I think this is something that we have to talk about some in connection with other bills. And I don't know, I mean, you hear a lot about how drug courts are fairly successful in their approach with wraparound services, hands-on, hand holding throughout the process, and with a fair degree of success. You don't hear that much about Tamarack. And I don't know why. I think that the AG's office was suggesting there's certain services aren't available. And I think if the services aren't available, that's something that we need to be addressing, I think. If Tamarack's primary existence, the point, is to take more violent offenders who are really arguably only in the system because of a substance use problem or mental illness, it seems like a perfect setup for more effectively connecting individuals with services in a criminal justice context. But I don't know, and I don't know enough about Tamarack and its success rate and whether, and how they produce success, what success means
Well,
in
my
Tamarack.
understanding is it's less successful than regular diversion, but you're dealing with a different population.
Yeah.
Dealing with repeat offenders, but my understanding is that for some, it does work if you can look in the services and stuff, and maybe that's something that we need to do in this bill is to expand, to make sure that people have access to Department of Health, Department of Department of Motor Vehicles. It's necessary to get a state ID just to have something available.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's there seems to be a missing link there somewhere, and something that I'm grappling with, something that I talked to AHS about, and I feel like understanding more about where there are maybe disconnects between systems that don't talk to each other, that perhaps could. I think in the area of mental health, we're taking on some of that work. They've started in 2024, have started more in the way of mobile health crisis response, mobile mental health crisis response. They've got mental health urgent care centers being set up across the state. And I think that this sort of more proactive approach to providing services is somehow also a key to a lot of the, what we're talking about when you have justice involved individuals with substance use and mental health problems. Anyway, but I don't know that we have great information about outcomes. What we do know, as you suggested, Senator Sears, is from an AGO report from several years ago, 98 to 95% of first-time offenders are successful in diversion. We also know that 90% of repeat offenders are unsuccessful. I'm not clear that we even know what we mean by success. And we refer to successful completion of diversion. To me, that means offenders are not reoffending.
Well, I think it's success completion is defined by completing all the requirements of the diversion program.
Right.
Not necessarily by not reoffending.
Right.
Which is different from our standard with people who are exiting the correction system, whether they be through probation, parole, or exiting time served.
But it seems to me that would be an important.
Usually not committing another crime.
Yeah, and it would be, I think to me, it would be an important metric to understand. I don't know that we know that. I mean, ideally, diversion is a system that diverts people out of the path of the criminal justice system. It does its job. People don't reoffend because of their diversion involvement. I'm not.
Well, the diversion does that, but also restorative justice, and that's where the confusion comes in. You've got how many, the Department of Corrections funds 20-something programs.
Yes.
which
Yeah.
AGO only does 14, I think. Well,
Right, yes, with the DOC programs or the municipalities, and yes, yeah.
so that, Senator Bahowski has a comment or question.
Yeah.
She represents a lot of different diversion programs.
Yes.
I
For,
do. We are blessed with a wealth of restorative justice and diversion options in Chittenden County. And I do really recognize that one of the things that's come so clear to me this biennium is that there are so many places where we have sort of a lack of data or a lack of centralized data. Remember last year, we did a data bill meant to actually track some of these outcomes of part of it was around tracking some of the outcomes of diversion and restorative justice, both in recidivism, but also in desistance, which I think is a really important aspect. You know, it is not simply, did someone ever engage again with the criminal legal system, but, you know, did they lower their level of engagement, which is also important. But what I do know from the sort of national data is that most of these restorative justice and diversion programs are shown to be highly effective. You know, nothing's 100% effective, but I know we heard testimony earlier this week, maybe it was last week, everything kind of bleeds together around one of the programs, and they reported over a 70%, 70% of their participants did not recidivate in the following 2 years. But I do think what is really, really important is for us to put all that data across the state in one place so we can look at it holistically.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should have the data, but perhaps where we make wholesale changes.
yeah,
Senator Norris.
Yes, thank you. And in looking at this and the report from the Justice Center, so on and so forth, first thing that popped into my mind, and not hate to use the word study or whatever else, but how do we track the success and the possible failures of this program due to the fact that we don't have the consistent outcomes, we don't have the data collection. I believe the program is working, but it seems to be rather vast in its approach toward things. So how do we do that?
Some people judge it by whether or not there's been a new crime committed. Some people judge it by completion of all the requirements of the diversion program. And when it comes to the teenage alcohol and teenage smoking and teenage whatever other one there is, I guess it's drugs. But when it comes to those, I think they just judge if I did the person complete the program. I don't know if there's been a study on the recidivism rates of people who've completed diversion. So if you know, usually it's 2 years, could be longer, but I don't know. Maybe Senator Bahowski remembers what we did. I thought we asked somebody to look at this.
We did last year in one of my favorite bills from last year, which was a very nerdy data bill. But we don't get a report back until 2025.
Oh, well, there you have it.
And there is national studies around, you know, recidivism and diversion. And I can't imagine Vermont is a huge outlier, but I hear I too want to see the data for Vermont, which is why I got really excited about that nerdy data bill.
In defense of the House bill, the goal there, one of the goals was to have more consistency statewide in terms of who gets charged, who doesn't get charged, recharge is post-charge and all that.
and yeah, and so that's coming in from the.
But Bennington's dealing with truancy,
Yeah.
which is different, I think, from most of the other. I don't know if she has a grant for that, but she has a relationship with courts to deal with truancy. And so I don't think most counties are dealing with truancy. So we have an advantage there anyway, that we're dealing with truancy, which is part of the pipeline. So
Yeah.
I don't, you know, it's hard to know. But I appreciate you bringing forward the concerns. You have suggestions.
Well, so my suggestions, which ultimately would not be my usual suggestion, is I do favor the section 4 reporting requirement. But because, I mean, a lot of this is because there were numerous witnesses in the House testimony numerous restorative justice organization witnesses who said, nothing about us without us. I mean, that was repeated really pretty consistently. I think they felt a bit excluded from the bill drafting process, the initial bill drafting process at the very least. So I do support an expanded report, as set out in section 4. I think recommendations should address, or should at least consider consolidation of restorative justice providers, the most effective oversight and funding structure, equitable allocation of existing resources, uniform data collection and reporting, including data on repeat offenders cycling through the diversion system, data sharing among restorative justice providers, which I think doesn't exist and probably should exist. The confidentiality requirements in this bill would not permit it. The reporting on uniform participant success standards, to the extent such a thing is possible. I believe that's in section 4 now with respect to post adjudication diversion. Reporting on the capacity of the community-based restorative justice providers, and approaches for greater stability and reliability for restorative justice providers. So that's what I would suggest is more of a bringing in the restorative justice community to talk more about the potential for restructuring, and efficiencies.
So if I look at that's that, and there was recommendations, and one which we've already started to implement, which is expanding the outreach by embedding social worker within the local law enforcement agency. So I think getting it through the state varies, but I do know that they are loaning, I guess it's a investment thing, with some locally.
Yes.
So we've done that.
Right, we did take on some of this work, which was, that was,
Yeah, but exploring the potential to expand types of cases and offenses that may be referred to diversion programs, including reference.
Yeah.
So that is one of the recommendations. Explore opportunities to consolidate administration and repair of the panels, court of diversion, Tamarack retail services in shared regional locations. And that comes up against what's developed organically throughout the state.
Right.
So I have no particular.
I mean, I have no objection to simple provisions in 645, which essentially require the AG's office to do a manual of uniform, I mean, sort of certain uniform practices, requiring, I mean, if some states attorneys now have policies. I think mandating a policy at the risk of losing resources doesn't make any sense. I would defer all of that to the state's attorney's offices. Yeah, I do know that they're severely stressed. They're asking for a number of personnel to be funded, to merely add to staffing and then add to administrative burden doesn't seem to make sense. So they can express their concerns, I'm sure, but
I expect they will.
yeah. But I do, so I mean, things like a uniform, I mean, the AG's office now does contracting and grants. You can build performance measures into those now. So that's maybe just something to think about.
And as Senator Wahowski pointed out, the reports that we're expecting aren't due until next year. So we don't have the reports available to see, to identify what is right now anecdotal.
Right.
Any other questions for you, Jay? Jay, thanks so much for taking time to listen this morning. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I see Isaac is up there, so I wasn't far off. There.
No. You were,
Isaac is there, but you are, I think,
Who's scheduled?
Think you got me?
I think you got Derek.
Yeah. Derek E. Depnick, Community and Restorative Justice Executive, Vermont Department of Corrections. Thanks for the opportunity. I will try to just make a couple DOC specific points, but also be mindful of the schedule alterations and intended noon stop today. I'm certainly happy to answer any questions. The primary focus of DOC's testimony on H645 is limited to section 4 of the bill, which creates the post-adjudication reparative program working group and report. That bill aligns with the statutory population that the Department of Corrections is responsible for with adjudication. And I will also make some comments regarding section 10.
Section what?
10 of the bill.
Oh,
Some language that I don't think originally appeared. I'm on page, at least on the copy, I have 59 or 59.
I'm on 50.
Okay, forgive me, I may have an older version.
But you're already up to page 59.
It's redesignation, it's the section 10 that I was thinking about, and again, if I on that.
My section 10 is redesignation,
Okay, that's what I'm looking at.
page 59.
That's exactly what I'm looking at as well.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and if I'm not mistaken, Chair Sears, you had asked last week when Corrections was here speaking more broadly about funding, a general question like, does DOC see the need for this stuff? Just to reground and begin sort of responding to that. My short answer to, is there a need for a study that looks at the post-adjudication reparative process? Yes, I think there is, and I think there is for many of the reasons that have already been discussed. I think the intent behind that study is to promote uniform access to these panels or boards, and that's a function of sentencing and a function of resourcing. And the goal, as stated in the legislation, is to create again uniform access and a stable and reliable funding structure. And I do think that requires some analysis to build on Jay's reference to the CSG report, and thank you for grabbing that subsection of it. Is really germane to this conversation on page 37, which I believe is just the maybe the third slide in that deck, because it's an excerpt. CSG captures a complexity well, in which they do reflect that diversion, pretrial, and alternative justice programs often vary in access and quality by county. Indeed, I think that's what this report is intended to address. And then they have a point, second bullet point there, which I would draw the committee's attention to. Reparative boards were established through legislation that required DOC to ensure boards exist throughout the state, while they are administered by 20 local community justice centers, that's now 17. Funding for the boards comes from discretionary grants administered and funded by DOC. So I think one, complicating variable in how the system has evolved is what was a point in time statutory requirement of DOC that DOC directly fulfilled by standing up these boards. We then evolved, or some might say devolved, some of that authority to the communities. But the funding mechanism with which we've continued to meet a statutorily required function and a critical function hinges on a discretionary funding mechanism. So I do think that there's probably a disconnect between the policy intent and then the reliable and stable funding mechanism through which we achieve that policy.
There's definitely a disconnect this year when the reputable boards
Yeah,
see a cut of 900,000 from DOC, which you view as there's no cut in the base. That 900,000 was one-time funding through justice reinvestment.
and
So I'm going through that as a member of the Senate Appropriations Committee, trying to figure that out. And at the same time, we have the council, which makes recommendations about how justice reinvestment funds are spent.
absolutely, and I
So there's a
believe,
great deal of miscommunication and talk about missed opportunities.
yeah, and I believe that 900 that you referenced, Chair Sears, refers to a total projected down across all state-funded community and restorative justice services, as
Wow.
opposed to just the ones DOC fund. I believe the
but it was-
DOC number
no, I
is
think
closer
it's
to
DOC.
600.
They, well, the,
Your point is not lost on me.
anyway, there's
but
900,000.
Yeah.
That they thought was base funding. You intended it for being one time. And who's right, who's wrong, I don't give a darn. We've got a $900,000 problem.
Yeah.
So that's just one example of what is in that section you highlighted about reparative.
Yeah, and I think the point that I would just add to that is that reparative boards, again, as funded by DOC through the discretionary power of the commissioner, however, DOC is required by statute to ensure their provision across the state. That's an example of a restorative justice service that the DOC serves as a funder and administrator of, and its basis is statutory. We bundle that funding for that with other restorative justice services that, while I consider to be leading edge and have demonstrable and data, to your point, based impacts, such as our COSA, Circles of Support and Accountability, those do not derive a statutory basis from which we fund those. So another complicating variable is that the funding that DOC puts out to our community justice providers, of which right now there are 17, and again, the naming convention that has sort of evolved over time is community justice centers, but I know, Senator, you had asked last week about what are we calling these things, and I do think it may be instructive for DOC to consider these as services, community and justice services that we fund. And I'll asterisk that because that ties back to my point that I'll make in a moment about section 10. But COSA has really compelling empirical data. UVM, Dr. Kathy Fox did a recidivism analysis of 139 cases that for high-risk, high-need individuals who had COSAs, and for all salient variables, except for one group had COSA and one group didn't, compare them, 139 individuals with that COSA. We saw a 28% recidivism reduction comparatively between those groups. COSAs don't have a statutory basis. So my point here, just being adding to the texture of this environment, is that DOC's grants you could construe as all discretionary funding, but it goes to a combination of a statutorily required service, reparative boards, and then discretionary services that we feel proud and happy to fund, but they don't have a basis. So to Jay's point, if the committee isn't inclined to consider broadening the scope of this study to the broader picture, I would want to call in the totality of the other discretionary services that DOC funds, only because to begin to pan back and still look at just the subset of legislatively required restorative justice activity funded by the state,
Yeah.
but exclude the discretionary, I think wouldn't achieve what I heard, and please correct me, Jay, is a desire to build a more cohesive and consistent infrastructure through which all of these.
If you would
services-
give us, you or somebody in the department could provide us with some language that would be, get where you want to be, that would be helpful.
So,
But I don't disagree with the need. I remain confused in many times about statewide. I'm
Yeah.
not confused about my own. I've spent enough time there to know what they do and how they do it.
yeah,
I mean, they're even doing after-school programs, so.
sure, because it's a wonderful
Which, you know,
rooted nonprofit
but I
that
don't-
does work for the
Right, it
state
doesn't-
and then pursues other opportunities, which is, I think,
You know,
what
they're-
all the state should have in every
I
region.
think what is consuming for what I observe is people spend more time trying to raise money and get grants than they do working with kids